everyone. This is Talk Back, and we're approaching probably one of the most exciting and important seasons of the year, election time. I know we're kind of sleepy now, but over the last few days, the last few weeks, so much has happened in the political world. If you don't know that it's time to get ready to vote, then you have been asleep. And I am so happy to have with us someone we've had on the show before, who is our Secretary of State, and she's got all the answers on voting and elections. Thanks, Stephanie Thomas. It's so nice to see you again.
Good
Hi.
to see you again, Sheila. Thanks for having me
Okay.
back.
Yes, we're doing this virtually today, but we'll be seeing you in studio as we get closer to the election, as it gets more exciting and more suspenseful.
I
So
don't know if I can take more excitement.
I don't know. Well, only if it's good. If it's good excitement, I'll handle that, right? We'll be able to. Now, just as a preface, people know my views. They've been watching, but you happen to be elected as a Democrat, but just let people know when you do your work as a Secretary of State, there is no partisan politics in the work. Just let everybody know that. That's
A hun-
important.
100%. Of course, I was elected as a Democrat, but I feel so strongly that the work of our office has to be 100% nonpartisan. We represent every voter and indeed every resident in Connecticut. So know that every single resource on our website is 100% nonpartisan.
So we got get that out of the way. That's the job of the Secretary of State of Connecticut. Here we are getting ready for November, and you and I have talked many times before about voter education, civic responsibility. It's not a requirement that you vote, but we are citizens, and many of us do feel a responsibility. And we have the age old question: how do we get more people to participate? Because you give out awards, and I'm in Colchester is my hometown, and you gave us an award for having a high percentage of voting compared to other places in some of the municipal elections. It still wasn't a great number, but it was better than other towns. And so the question becomes how, and I keep asking this question, I know if you have the answer, how many unregistered adults over 18 and over people do we have in the state who have not even registered?
Obviously, it's a moving number. I think we have just over 100,000 eligible but unregistered voters. But what I find a much more troubling number is that for presidential elections, on average, our turnout is 80%. But in local municipal elections, which happen every other year, average turnout is 34%. So I'm always thinking about that delta between people who are already registered to vote, know how to vote, know where to go, think it's important, but why are they not showing up? And I think, we have to look at both of those metrics when we're talking about turnout.
Yeah. Well, I always think of a couple of things. We are losing journalism on the local level more and more. And so more and more people are living in communities where they may pay their taxes, but they may not have a stake or feel close to the government, even though Stephanie, the local government is where you have your streets and your schools and your power, right? All the things that are really most important as you wake up each morning and go about your lives. So, why don't you talk about that? It's an interesting irony that
Yeah.
we don't vote, but I really also think why don't you talk about the fact that we're losing that local newspapers, the Hartford Current, our state paper
Yeah.
used to have a section for every town. They've lost that. Talk about that as a way of harming civic education
Yeah.
and participation.
Like all challenges, right? They're not like there's not one cause and effect. So the reason why I think losing the newspaper, the local newspaper outlet and coverage, is that when I'm actually out talking to people, a lot of people don't know when the elections are, what's on the ballot, or like any of the details. So I think there's a broader issue. Anyone who has heard me spoke knows that I think we need more investment in our election system. There is no funding currently for public education. our public outreach. And I think that is part of the issue. I think sometimes our turnout is so hard in presidential because you can't turn around without hearing about it in the national news, seeing commercials, etc. Everybody knows when it's coming and who's on the ballot, right? But in municipal elections, there's not a lot of money spent, and we rely on political parties and political candidates to basically be the main source of election related information, and they only have to reach out to the people that they need to win their election, which is why I lobby for more funding for our office, because I think there should be a non-partial entity out there who is tasked with communicating to every voter how to register, when elections are, how to find your polling place, etc. And that doesn't exist. And I think we're seeing the impact of that.
Yeah. Is there any legislation in the pipeline in the Connecticut legislature on this?
We've lobbied the last two sessions for public education funding, but we have not received it, but I will keep asking. And in the interim, our office, because we don't have the money, we have gotten really, really creative. And we try to think out of the box. We have some great interns. So for the first time, we are putting together a voter guide for the presidential election. And that is where a lot of states, they send that voter guide to all of their eligible voters, and it gives them the sample ballots and tells them how to register, how to find their polling place, and everything else. So we won't have funding to mail it out, but we will make it available on the website. And we've built very close partnerships with more than 300 organizations that we hope will help us push out not only the voter guide, but information about early voting and all other types of education pieces.
Reach into the schools, whether it's the high schools, even the junior high schools, and even the colleges and universities, because we're always complaining every 4 years that our college kids are not as active as they should be in coming out to vote.
Yeah, like we complain a lot about things. I do the same, but at work anyway, we try to think about what the complaint is and what we can do to address it. So, for example, last year we were thinking, like, okay, what are the barriers to young people getting more involved? So, we did a little focus group with a group of our interns and some other young people at college campuses. And guess what they told us? Like, they're really confused about stamps. like and like they didn't grow up in postal mail. Like they're like, wait, how do you address an envelope? Like literally these are the barriers. So that prompt, and they were really confused. Do they vote at their school location, their hometown location? So that prompted us to put together on our public facing website, one of them, civics101.ct.gov, like a 1, 2, 3. If you're in college, this is what you need to do to vote. So we're trying to address like literally all of these problems simultaneously with no budget.
Well, just give us the quick answer. If you're in college, you still registered as a Democrat, Republican, or unaffiliated in your hometown, right? And you've got
Well,
to.
no. So this is the problem. Like
Okay.
nothing in election law is a quick answer. So people have to know to go to our website. But college students can choose if they want to register in their hometown or where they're residing for college.
Okay.
So they get to make that choice. Um, uh, and then there are some little things about the address that you have to use if you're voting by absentee ballot, like your college address. So there are little things like that. It's not necessarily so straightforward, but and there's a little thing that most people don't realize. A parent of a college student is allowed to drop off their absentee ballot for them. So we encourage everyone to go to our civics101.ct.gov portal to get like all the details.
Okay. Can you predict that we will have a greater percentage of young people voting in Connecticut this year than we did 4 years ago? Or you
If I
know,
If I could predict voter turnout, I would also buy a Powerball ticket.
Okay, okay.
I,
I
it,
figured.
there's so many variables. Registration is actually like only one, and maybe not the most important one. Excitement about who's on the ballot tends to have a lot of impact. How competitive that race is has a lot of impact. How much communication they receive about when to vote and how to vote has an impact. Yeah, so we're
Well,
working on all those things.
well, Stephanie, it's interesting that 4 years ago we had a great turnout, and a lot of it perhaps had to do with COVID and the fact that we were able to vote by mail or the use of the drop boxes. Of course, one of the issues in the controversy over the Trump and Republican claims about the election not being proper was the fact that they were so opposed to mail-in and drop boxes. Are we still using drop boxes in Connecticut?
I do find that ironic only because
Isn't it?
Trump had, I believe, voted by absentee ballot.
Right.
So one thing I like to make clear to everybody, except especially since we have the ballot question that we'll all get to vote on in November about no excuse absentee voting. So there are currently 29 states who have no excuse absentee voting. And then, of course, 8 other states are 100% voting by mail. You don't even go to a polling place. So Connecticut, again, is in the minority in terms of the rest of the country. And in all 29 of those states, the way absentee ballots are handled is slightly different. For example, in Alaska, if you want to, you can waive privacy and fax your vote in and your ballot. And that's because November in Alaska, very different than November in Connecticut. So would Connecticut allow you to fax your ballot? Of course not. It makes no sense for our environment. Many states started no excuse absentee voting. Some started it because they found people were voting by absentee when they weren't really allowed to. Like I remember years ago, before we changed our law, people would tell me like, "Oh, I work in New York City, so I usually get home late, so I'm going to vote by absentee ballot." Years ago, that was not legal in Connecticut, but no one knew because they wanted to vote. And also, a lot of states have started no excuse absentee voting to cut down on any loopholes to prevent fraud because there's better tracking of who received the ballot, where it is in the process. And in most of those states, the government has stepped in the one handling the absentee ballots versus having candidates handling it like we have in Connecticut right now. So yes, we still have drop boxes. And people think drop boxes were new during the pandemic. They were just new to Connecticut. Other states have been using drop boxes for like a decade.
So to clarify that, Connecticut law was requiring that you had to actually affirmatively swear that you were going to be either out of state or your illness, have an illness, or a specific reason that had to be checked off. And so we're not going to have that if what we're going to try to change that in Connecticut. How are we changing that?
Let me paraphrase. Yes. So in Connecticut, under current law, you have to meet one of 6 very specific
Right.
reasons to vote by absentee ballot. There is a question that would amend our state constitution so that Connecticut could look at a different absentee ballot type of program called No Excuse. So you don't have to meet one of those 6 reasons. So if you vote yes on that ballot question, what that means is the legislature would then decide if they want to take it up. And it has to go through the usual lawmaking process, has to go through committee, public hearing, etc. If you vote no, it means you want to keep it, that you have to meet one of those 6 reasons.
So it's interesting. Other states may not have this requirement also. We have to amend our constitution to be able to change the law. We cannot just go to the legislature tomorrow and get a law passed saying you can have no excuse absentee voting, right?
That's
So,
correct, and the reason why, like, people don't realize this, and I don't know why either, like, but Connecticut is, I believe, one of only 2 states that have a lot of its election law built into its state constitution. Most states don't have this, and it could be because Connecticut is so old, and we have the oldest constitution in the country, so maybe we thought it was a good idea. But most states, the legislature can go in and make these changes. But in Connecticut, we have this added barrier. And I remind people it's not so unusual, just related to absentee ballot law. We've had 5 or 6 constitutional amendments, the very first starting to allow Civil War soldiers to vote. Um,
right,
and other ones were added for other wars, for people if the election fell on a religious holiday where people were not allowed to go out or drive a car, etc. It was added for poll. We had to do a constitutional amendment allowing poll workers to vote
right,
in absentee because
right.
they were going to be somewhere else working that day. So it's not that unusual in Connecticut. It just sounds like a big
Right,
deal. um,
right. But of course, 4 years ago, we did have an executive order that enabled us to go out, or not go out, enabled us to stay home and vote uh, by absentee, by
yes.
mail, because of COVID. That was an exceptional executive order situation. And that helped really raise the percentage of people voting. It really did. But so now we need to make sure to pay attention on the ballots and not everybody that's running all the offices, but that constitutional amendment question.
Yes.
Answer that yes, so that the legislature can pass a law for no excuse voting. But we also have amended the constitution so that we can have early voting, so that you're not going to be in town on election day, but you're going to be able to vote earlier. So talk about that. That's already in place.
I love early voting. Started in Connecticut this year, but many people don't know about it because of that public education money we didn't get. But so early voting allows you to vote in person prior to election day. So for primary elections, like we have coming up on August 13th, we have 7 days of early voting. And for the general election on November 5th, we have 14 days of early voting. Again, you can go to civics101.ct.gov to get all the details. But in brief, this is like amazing because just think about it. For the first time ever in Connecticut, you can vote on a Saturday or a Sunday. Like that in and of itself makes it a winner in my book, for anyone who's busy, which by the way is everybody these days. And Connecticut was the 47th state in the country to adopt early voting. So it's not new. It's been around since the 80s. So 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., most days of early voting. But just keep in mind the Tuesday and Thursday prior to the election, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So it's amazing for absolutely anyone. And people ask me what to expect. Every town has one location. So you'll want to check our website or the town's website to see where that is. It's usually town hall. So you can go vote early. It looks a little different. They'll confirm when you show up that you're an eligible voter, like they do on election day. They'll give you their ballot, but they'll also give you an envelope. You'll go to your privacy booth. You'll vote like always, but you'll put your ballot into the envelope, seal it, and then deposit that in the receptacle as instructed, like you typically would. Those ballots are locked under seal all the days of early voting, and then they are not opened until election day. And just one important thing, because I get this question a lot. Once you vote early, you cannot go back and change your vote. So you want to make sure you're like fully committed. And that's a little different than our absentee ballot law. And then I remind people nothing at all has changed with election day. You go to your usual polling place, the usual hours on election day, like that hasn't changed at all.
So it's important if you are in a big city and you usually vote at a certain precinct, a certain election place. That's not the case for early voting. It may be a designated one place in town that you need to go to. So hopefully the secretaries or the town clerks in all of the towns and cities will make sure that there's education about that. I hope so.
And
That's
Sheila,
not-
let
Yeah,
me add one thing, because I do think it's a culture change. It is so new here in Connecticut. We've only used it for one election so far. So people aren't familiar with it, but we all just have to get more familiar with early voting. You'll have to check our website or the town's website for more details, because large towns, any town over 20,000 people, can choose to have multiple locations for early voting, but those decisions aren't required to be made by law until very close to the election. So your town might have one location for the primary, but choose to have three locations for the general election, or five or eight.
right.
We won't know. So we all just have to get into this habit of going back to look. And again, you can always check our website, myvote.ct.gov, which is our main election site, or you can check with your registrar of voters.
So Stephanie, will you be having any PSA, public service announcements around the time to get people geared up and more knowledgeable about what they might need to do for the early?
Zero, because we receive $0 to do
Oh,
that.
well,
But we do have partnerships with some media companies. We also beg a lot. And I think most people feel like they have a civic duty to try to educate people. So last year for the election, for example, we do shows like this on public access, other shows. And like some of the media companies decided to record and run for free some public service announcements in the weeks leading up to the election. So we will certainly beg all of those people again this year to try to get the word out.
so I have an idea. When you come on again in October
Mhm.
in the studio, we can do a 1 minute, a 30-second, or a 60-second PSA type of thing, and we will run it over and over again. I'm sure the
Perfect.
studio would do that. That would be great, and we need that everywhere so
Yeah.
people are aware. And I just to clarify for people, we've got 169 cities and towns in Connecticut. They are what is the sharing of responsibility between what you do as a Secretary of State in charge of elections and what each town clerk is responsible for? How's the
Yeah,
yeah.
it's hard to explain and no one understands it.
Well, because
Um,
people blame sometimes people say it's the Secretary of
I know
State's fault
it's
with
not
something,
us.
but
Yeah,
not always. It's the town has a
yeah.
great responsibility in
So
printing ballots and the whole thing. Yeah.
yes. So a good way to think about it, most of the control is in your town. So your registrar has to administer the election. They maintain the voter list in your town. They handle voter registration. Um, and they are tasked with running their polling place, for example. Our role is to oversee basically the administration of this work. So we have to make sure there is a training program for registrars to learn how to do this. We have to check periodically to make sure they've finished their training. We make sure they are following the law. So like, for example, for their early voting plan, their early voting location has to be ADA compliant. So if they send us a plan and we see it's not, we have to go back to them and tell them, like, no, you have to do this. So we're making sure that they are complying with federal and state law. And be aware that there are some things they do that have to do with town charters, and we have no jurisdiction over that. The other thing people get confused about, registrars don't work for us, they work for the town. So although we can suggest that they do many things, we cannot compel them to do them unless it is an infraction about something they have to do. And then if we expect they are breaking the law, or we get a complaint, we have no jurisdiction to investigate that. We have to turn it over to the State Elections Enforcement Commission. So, there are a lot of us involved in the administration of elections. And it's important to understand who does what.
Okay, so let's just go off, since the early voting is a big, big deal. Let's get specific. When is election day in November? What's the date? And going back from that date, when can we go early and vote? Give us maybe the exact, if we
Yeah,
can.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Election day is Tuesday, November 5th. All the early voting periods end on the Sunday before election. So the early voting period for the November 5th election goes from October 21st through Sunday, November 3rd.
Sounds good. So let's talk about the way we vote, the scan. In my town, there are scanners. Is it an individual decision in each community as to what type of system that they might use? How does
Yes
that
and no.
work?
Yes and no. So, almost 20 years ago, the state purchased the optical scanner machines for every town in Connecticut. Um, and we are in the RFP process now to purchase new equipment. So, and this is like the weird sharing. Like, we pay for the licensing to host the voter registration system, for example, but every town controls its own voter list. We pay for the optical scanners, the tabulators that people feed their ballot into, but every town pays for the maintenance of that equipment. So there is some sharing there. So every polling place, there are some laws that are required, such as what positions have to be at a polling place. Like there has to be a checker, a tabulator tender, etc. There are laws around things like the 75-foot rule, which is that you can't have electioneering and like candidates talking about themselves within 75 feet of the polling place. So there are state and federal laws about ADA compliance, etc., voter privacy, the fact that a candidate or your employer or an agent of your union can't assist you with voting. Like there are all these laws in place that every town has to follow, but the rest of it is up to the discretion of the registrar. So if the statute says you need, for early voting, for example, 3 people in the polling place to staff it. A town may say, I need 30 people, or they may say, I need 10 people. And we look at that and make sure we think it sounds like they'll be able to comply with the law based on the number of staff they have. So it gets a little complicated. But
So just to clarify, the ADA is the disabilities,
correct,
wheelchair access and things like that.
correct.
So now let's talk about enforcement. So the 75-foot rule. When people complain that somebody may not be following correctly one of these provisions, how is it enforced? Who do they complain to? What
Yep.
role do you play in those kinds of things? And that's the other big question that I want you to talk about is on election day, what happens? What is your role in this whole process?
Yeah. So a lot of times we are subject matter experts and liaisons. So let's take your example. A voter walks in and says, hey, the candidate is standing on the other side of the line. Polling place moderators, not even the registrar, but the moderator in every single polling place has control over that polling place. So the moderator can go outside and say, hey, you have to step over this line. And that happens a lot because sometimes people get to talking and walk on the other side, etc. So let's say the moderator has asked the person to move and they won't, or they keep straying over the line. That moderator or registrar might call our office and ask what to do. So if we think it is a legal situation or an infraction, we have to report it to seek. We might ask the moderator a lot of questions like, can you expel them? You know, sometimes the moderator doesn't feel safe having some sort of confrontation. If it's a town where a police officer is stationed there, we might suggest that they ask the officer to get involved. So every situation is very environment specific. So we sort of take in the questions. We have lawyers on call, etc. Sometimes if it's very complicated, we may have to send a lawyer out to the polling place. A good example of that was a situation where someone was outside the polling place, outside the 75-foot rule, but because of the placement of the windows in the location, anyone voting could see their and they were like doing a big thing. So we had to call in lawyers to take a look at that to see if that would be an infraction of the law. So it's very complicated, but we always say, you know, I'll borrow. If you see something, say something, because there are several steps that might apply.
So another thing that I want to chat about with you is a big deal is made many times by the Trump people about voting fraud. And we know from everything that happened in 2020 that there were a minuscule number of cases where people committed fraud, and in many cases they were Republicans and not even Democrats. And so I need you to help us demystify that also. What and they talk about the chances of fraud by people gathering votes and putting them in the election boxes, uh, and different things. Please demystify us. Tell us that
Yeah.
how much fraud in voting have you seen in Connecticut over the years, and what are the safeguards? And we need to set that to rest, don't we?
We do. And I'm only going to talk about Connecticut, but part of the problem is people watch national news and they don't realize that election law, not only is it incredibly complicated with a lot of checks and balances built in, but it is different in every single state. So I get emails now today like, disconnect our machines from the internet and like go back to paper ballots. Connecticut happened to be one of the states where we're so far behind the times. We never moved from paper ballots, and now they're back, which is great. So we have always been doing it the way the experts advise. So you know, what people point to now, like Bridgeport is a perfect example. We have seen several court cases, dozens of violations reported to the State Elections Enforcement Commission. So a lot of people are like, that proves it. It's widespread. But there's a couple of things you have to think about. One, some of it is common sense. The reason you know about it is because it was caught, which means the system allowed it to be caught. And that is the point of having all of the checks and balances. Another really important thing to realize is that like there is a difference between voter fraud and some systematic things. Like one of the stories in Bridgeport had to do with this person dropping what looked would appear to be, it's still in court, so I'll have to say allege, dropping too many absentee ballots into a drop box. Most people know we have election monitors installed in Bridgeport now. We had it for the redo of the election, etc. And one of the things we decided to do was to call people who had requested an absentee ballot just to like check in on them, like you good, like did you receive it, etc. And a lot of at least 4 people like told us very specifically at a level where we could then report it. Yes, I believe in voting. I filled out my ballot, like, and I'm all good. Like, everything is done by the book. Oh, and then I gave it to the nice lady to drop it off for me. So that voter thought they did everything right. Their vote is what they meant to do, but they didn't realize that in Connecticut, only certain people can drop off your absentee ballot. And that's because that is not the law everywhere. In many states, anybody can drop off your absentee ballot. Like if you want to drop off your neighbors, it's fine. You just can't do that in Connecticut. So there's all of these very complicated issues, but every study ever done anywhere in any state, honestly, for decades in the United States of America has shown that ballot fraud, voting fraud is so minuscule. I believe the biggest number that has ever come up is 0.00001% of all cases were fraudulent of votes cast. So it's not a problem. I understand it's a narrative. People keep hearing it. And they get frightened, but there are many checks and balances. And if you see something that seems off, that's why you've reported, so it can get investigated and make sure any loopholes are closed. And the legislature did that based on the Bridgeport cases and a lot of what our election monitors reported seeing on the ground. We were able to close a few more loopholes, and that's how you chip away at that very small number that, are willing to try to do wrong. And even in Bridgeport, you'll note it's always the same people. So it's not like there's legions of people, but many of the cases are around literally the same 3 to 5 people.
Just one more question about that.
Mm-hmm.
Forgetting about our own people, our own voters, our own politicians trying to do something wrong in voting. We worry about foreign people, China, Russia. People talk about hacking our systems. Please talk about that. Tell us the minuscule chances of that and whether you think we have enough protection for something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we do have a big problem with foreign interference, right? But not about hacking systems. Like I said, we're not connected to the internet with our elections in any way. Like there's no threat of that. And because our system is so decentralized with every single town running its own election, like I just can't imagine, like, is Russia going to send people to go to 169 towns? Like, no. So that's not the issue. What's the issue is foreign interference in terms of disinformation. We know for a fact through Homeland Security that this year more money is being spent by these foreign adversaries to sow chaos and distrust in our elections. So I like to harken back. There was a story in Forbes magazine last month that was talking about an influencer group that is linked with Russia, for example, who in a 2-day period stood up 120 websites that seem to be by credible journalists. And they can do this with AI. They scrape real content. So it looks like this site has been around forever. Like it can be the Norwatch News Watch, and it looks like, oh, maybe I never heard of it, but look, they have all this content for the last 5 years. But then they start populating disinformation and people take that as a credible source. So I just remind people, election fraud is not the thing we have to worry about. It's election disinformation. And especially with bad actors being able to use AI, we have things we have to be concerned about. You have to go to our website for trusted information. You have to research what you hear. If anything sounds too good or too bad to be true, it probably isn't. And you can't take it at face value anymore. A lot of people are like, oh, this sounds so scary. Things change all the time. When the internet came on the scene, a lot of things changed because people were getting information from other sources. So this is true with AI and misinformation. What we have to change is our way of viewing this content and making sure that it's from a trusted source. And just by way of example, like imagine you get a robocall in your town saying, in the voice of your registrar or in my voice saying, like, I don't know, for some reason the election has been canceled today. Like, if that sounds a little fishy to you, like, check our website, call your town, etc. Because these are the types of things that could happen. So we just have to be aware of it so that we can fight it.
We're in Connecticut and we are pro voting and getting more people out to vote, but we cannot deny that there are states in this country who have passed laws that try to suppress the vote, make it difficult for people to vote. And I'm sure that as a Secretary of State, you're involved in the national group of secretaries of state that are interested in making sure that doesn't happen. Is there kind of a coalition of secretaries of state who are working together to make sure we don't have these suppression laws in other states?
There is a national group, the National Association of Secretaries of State. What is really important, it is the oldest nonpartisan national group for public officials, like ever. Um, and good news, I was just named to the executive board a couple of weeks ago, so I'm excited about that. And we do work together on a nonpartisan basis. But one thing we agreed to do is we don't know all the details about other people's states. So we have a pledge that we do not talk about other people's states. But, if you have a question, you call the secretary. So there are definitely a lot of conversations about making sure eligible but unregistered voters receive information about how to register, about how do we do community outreach effectively to make sure no one is left behind, how we can work with our legislatures to enact civic education legislation or other laws. But I have to respect that despite Connecticut's governor, executive branch, our legislature, etc. Other states don't have the same values. And if their duly elected people are carrying out the wishes of their electorate, although as Stephanie Thomas, the person, I can lobby against that or send postcards, etc. As Secretary Thomas, I wouldn't want them to tell me what to do, and I don't tell them what to do.
Worried about. It is, right? It is something to be concerned about, this election, right?
Yeah, I mean, but and this is why, I can only talk about Connecticut, but I think it's really important that people understand that a lot of the trends in the country, around the country, elsewhere, are to roll back some voting rights in some states, right? Or to make it harder, etc., to register and whatnot. So if that is something that you do not want to see happen in Connecticut, obviously I'm secretary, but you have to realize these types of things are not set by the secretary, they are set by the legislature. So I give everyone the same advice about every issue, any issue that they care about. You cannot wait until you see the headline saying something was taken away to start getting involved in government and your legislative bodies at the local, state, or federal level. You have to make sure they know your values all the time. A lot of people like talk about, I voted. I'm like, policy is not written on election day. Election day is one day, or now with early voting, more days. But you have to vote, yes. But you also have to stay involved the other 364 or whatever days a year, because you have to make sure your values get translated into the policies that are set. So it's never too early to write to your legislators to make sure if you enjoy early voting or you enjoy being able to register the day of the election. Not every state has that. Connecticut does. Make sure you let your elected officials know what you like as well as what you don't like, because then if there's a threat, they know, oh, I have to fight for this.
Well, let's finish up our discussion by talking about election day itself. First of all, there is going to be a primary in the dead of
Mhm.
summer, August 13th, right?
Yes,
For
correct.
judges of probate, other legislative races that may not have been settled, that where there's a primary, right?
Yeah.
People need to know that.
There's also a statewide primary on the Republican side for the Senate.
Oh, okay, that's right, for the United States Senate. That's August 13th, and as you said, there are 7 early voting days for that, for the
Yep.
primary. Okay. And
August
now,
5th through 11th.
leading up to Election Day, what are you most concerned about? What are the issues that, I don't know, keep you up at night? Or what is it that is most important for you to tell us about gearing up for Election Day and on Election Day in November, and the early voting on that
Yeah,
also?
I mean, honestly, what I'm most concerned about is misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation is what I talked about earlier. People putting out incorrect information on purpose, trying to harm and throw people off. Misinformation is what we all do: share information that is wrong, but with no intent to harm. So I'm just afraid that a lot of disinformation will be out there, and like people think they're like sharing news, but it's all false. Obviously we do drills for this, we work with Homeland Security, FBI, state police, all of these things, but I just implore every single person to take that extra step and make sure that you are not part of the problem in spreading misinformation. And then the only other thing I would say is um, everyone should vote. Even not voting is a vote, because there's always a winner in elections. And here in Connecticut, many of our elections, people don't realize, like last year alone, we had over 20 elections, I think, decided by fewer than 20 people. Every year, we have elections decided by one vote. This happens all the time in Connecticut. So it's really important. And now with early voting, it's easier than ever before, especially if you still want to vote in person. So please, please, please go out and vote. Every vote counts. It's your voice.
So wonderful. I just want to say, let's get to the polls on that day. So you're a non-voter. You don't vote. You're not even registered. Tell us what you can do on election day itself or in the several weeks before leading up to election day. What do you do?
Sure. So for the November election, if you missed the registration cutoff, you can show up at your early voting location or on election day at the same day registration location. So that allows you, assuming you can prove that you are eligible to vote, so you'll have to bring your IDs and whatnot, you can register and vote on the same day. For primary elections, it's slightly different. Better to go to our website to get all the details. But in general, you can still show up during early voting and register, but you won't be able to vote until election day. But if you're an unaffiliated voter and you want to switch into a party, you can do that by showing up and then voting a subsequent day.
So I wonder how many people realize that if they're not voters, they can go on election day itself, bring their IDs, bring their information, and vote right then and there. It's a very, very important thing because we still have probably hundreds of thousands of people in Connecticut who are not registered,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Okay,
Yep.
so I want you to give us your final thoughts about the importance of this year and give us a enthusiastic kickoff for this election season, what we need to do.
That's a lot of pressure, pressure, Sheila. Um, I believe with all my heart that every single election is important. The presidential, of course, gets a lot of attention, but as you said earlier, you also have to vote next November and the next November and the next November. So my final words would be make sure you're vote ready. Think about it now. Go to our website, familiarize yourself with where your polling place is, etc. Don't wait till the last minute because that's when you get derailed. Things always happen in life like, oh, I forgot I have to do this, or I have to now travel for work, or I have an emergency, a flat tire, fill in the blank. So try to get vote ready now and have like your plan A and your backup plan, so that you really, your vote is your voice, and it is a gift when I talk to people from other countries, and even people who are disenfranchised in other states. Please don't waste it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie Thomas, our Connecticut Secretary of State. You've given us some good inspiration to move forward. And again, as I said, you've got to be half asleep if you don't know what's happening in the election world today. And please, everybody, vote. And Secretary, we'll see you as we get closer to Election Day. And good luck to us. And let's hope this country lives up to the ideals of a true democracy. Let's hope. Keep it going. Thank
Fingers
you so
crossed.
much.
We can do it.
Fingers crossed. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you all next time on Talk Back. Bye.
Bye bye.